Christian Anarchism Frequently Asked Questions, number 7. Why didn't Peter tell Cornelius to leave the army? Okay, so maybe John going easy on the soldiers in that last video we talked about can be credited to his pre-kingdom perspective, right? But what about the apostles' treatment of soldiers after Jesus had been crucified and resurrected? I mean, they've heard the Sermon on the Mount, right? So, for instance, what about the Gentile centurion whom Peter preached the gospel to but didn't tell to leave the army? And that's Cornelius, of course, in Acts chapter 10. For those whose memory of the story is hazy, Cornelius was a Gentile centurion in the Italian cohort who was what you'd call a God-fearer, somebody who believed in Israel's God, though being a Gentile. And after he has a vision of an angel, he's instructed to send for the apostle Peter, which he did. Peter had his own vision in which he was chastised for seeing Gentiles as unclean, thus beginning the first gospel mission to Gentiles. Though this was indeed after Jesus was resurrected, a similar argument can be made about Peter's limited point of view as we made about John the Baptist. After all, Peter has just figured out that the gospel can go out to Gentiles. If he's missing something that basic to the mission of Jesus, perhaps he hadn't fully gotten the memo yet about Jesus' new kingdom not being like an earthly kingdom with armies. It's also possible that in the moment it wasn't at the forefront of Peter's mind, or that Peter did discuss it with Cornelius, but that the author Luke's interest in this section of his book was on the gospel going out to Gentiles, so he only discussed the details which he thought were pertinent and central to that concern in his narrative. Ultimately, though, it's an argument from silence, so there isn't much that can be said either way. Speaking of building a theology from silence, Preston Sprinkle noted in his book Fight, A Christian Case for Nonviolence, that, quote, as a centurion, Cornelius, as well as the centurion in Matthew 8, would not only be pressured to worship foreign gods, but also was responsible for leading various ceremonies on behalf of his cohort. As a centurion, Cornelius would essentially function as a pagan priest. True, Peter doesn't forbid Cornelius to use violence, but neither does he forbid him to perform pagan duties, because that's not the point of the story. Acts 10 and other soldier salvation passages highlight one basic point. The gospel pierces the hearts of unlikely people, even Roman military leaders. End quote. If we're going to use Peter's silence to prove that soldiering is acceptable for Christians, should we also assume that he was okay with Christians conducting pagan rituals? This argument from silence, like most arguments from silence, doesn't prove what its proponents hope that it does.